Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3.
UD was actually much nicer. Like this last 10 minutes, she like calmed way down. Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
She was like fun. Then she was like nice to be around.
Yeah.
That made me feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's all right.
I think so too.
Hello.
Hi there.
Do you see me in the center of the screen or to the side?
Excuse me?
Do you see my face in the center of the screen or to the side?
You're pretty much in the center.
Oh, okay. On my computer, it's a little different.
Good evening, everyone. The time has just gone 7:45. A big welcome to everyone. Danny, you can take us live and remove our screen sharing. A big welcome to everyone this evening. So nice to see you already. We've got an amazing panel this evening, and we are joined. Arthur Lenk, you spent too long a time in South Africa. You are still wearing your jacket. How is it possible that someone sitting in Israel would dress that formally?
Well, when I see you, I get dressed up, Howie.
I don't blame you, Arthur. What have you been doing? You've been out of South Africa now 3 years.
Well, hang on, Howard. I'm having problems with my volume. I'm not hearing you clearly.
Okay,
So,
do you want to
chat with one of the other boys.
Okay.
I'll come back to
Emmanuel,
you.
perfect. Emmanuel, my guess is your accent is going to be much cooler than anyone else's on this panel.
It's not going to be as South African as yours.
Very impressive, but let's hear that little French tinge.
Well, who said I have a French accent? You know, I took, my parents actually sent us to an English-speaking school in Paris when we were kids. So I started learning English for a very young age.
Okay, and how long have you been in Israel?
I've been in Israel since 1993.
Okay, that's quite a journey and
Quite an amount of time.
And you are our foreign policy expert on the panel.
Okay.
Oh, no, you're supposed to say, of course I am. I'm an expert in these
If
things.
you say so.
There goes my credibility. Paul Weiner, welcome. Weiner. Okay. Where in the world does Paul Weiner originally hail from?
United States.
Where in the United States? It's a very big place.
New Jersey and Florida.
Okay. And when did you make Aliyah to Israel?
I've been here about 28 years.
Fantastic. And you are chairman, in fact, of the Likud Anglo division.
Yeah, it's my group, the Likud Anglo division.
Okay. And what does that actually mean?
Well, that we were looking to promote things that will help English speakers from around the world to make Aliyah better and be political for all of Israel.
So we, of course, have people watching us from all over the world. I see Aubrey and Etienne have just joined us from Toronto, and we know they had their vaccine last week. Can I presume that everyone on the panel has had a vaccine? Yishai, have you had a vaccine?
I have.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't think that that's going to affect our conversation, right? This is virtual. I don't have to put on a mask for this thing, do I?
You don't have to put on a mask, but it
Should I put on a mask?
It is possible, Yishai, that you will be broadcasting in 5G. Who knows?
That's fine. But my point is that, you know, we are getting healthy here in Israel. There's two kinds of people who are getting healthy. One is the vaccinated kind, and the other is the people who got sick and are getting better. That's also, you get green passport for that. Also, I say to my friends who are against vaccinations, just get sick and you're going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. I'm trying to promote people getting past the corona, you know, kind of stupor everybody is in. Just like, okay, let's come out, let's start coming out, let's start feeling good again. We can trust one another. We're good people, we're clean people, you know, and we're not like disease carriers. And so I myself am vaccinated. My wife and I are vaccinated, but I have friends on the other side of the aisle, and I don't know. I just want people to a little bit calm down from this. Let's not see each other as enemies, and start to come out. You know, let's try to come into the summer already ready to come back to real life and not be like germies to the end. Anyway, that's just a little.
Well, you way ahead of us in Israel. We've only done about 120,000 people out of about 57 million. So we have a long way to go. Arthur, let's test your audio. How's your audio looking?
No, it's better now, I think.
Okay, fantastic. I presume you and Ruth have both been vaccinated?
We have, and all three of our daughters as well. Israel's at a point that it's everybody from 16 up that's interested. Please come and we'll give you free food or anything to get everybody vaccinated, and we're actually doing well with that.
Fantastic. I mean, Israel certainly leads the world, and here in South Africa, we keep on looking at your figures, and we say, well, we're very far behind, but we forget in places like France, Emmanuel, that France isn't doing so well in terms of vaccinations. Right.
Neither is the rest of the European Union. They have done a very poor job in importing the vaccine and vaccinating the population. So on this specific issue, Israel has done well on the vaccines. I mean, hasn't done very well on other issues regarding the corona crisis, but it has done definitely well regarding the vaccine.
So, Arthur, we were actually asking just before we were checking your audio, we were actually saying you've been out of South Africa 3 years. Your hair has not grown back.
No.
I'm sorry. But what have you been doing since you were Israeli ambassador to South Africa?
Well, so we're coming up on 4 years almost.
Oh wow! Okay.
Summer of 17, we came home, and I took a leave from government for a while, and then decided it was enough, and retired from the Foreign Service a couple of years ago. Formed a company, helping innovative Israeli companies, a little bit with solar energy in South Africa, a lot of education in Azerbaijan, the place I was ambassador before South Africa. And I see Dina on the line now. Hi, Dina. How are you? Long time.
You will notice from Dina's lighting that she's in the middle of load shedding, I'm guessing at the moment, because it looks like there are a few torches. So load shedding is the South African term that we use when our government messes up so badly they turn off the lights. And we're busy going through that at the moment. So I still have electricity, although I'm due to go off, I think, fairly soon. Dina, I presume from your lighting, you're sitting in the dark.
That is absolutely correct. I'm just trying to figure out exactly. Right now I look like I'm glowing, but I'll try to fix that. But yes, I am officially in the dark.
And Dina, you're on the panel because you're actually going to tell us just after 8 o'clock about our next, well, not our next webinar, because our next webinar is tomorrow, but you're going to tell us about what you're doing on Wednesday evening. Give us the 10-second headline of that, and then we're going to talk more about it just after 8 o'clock.
10-second headline. Pesach is coming. God help us all. So we are here to help with the cooking recipes from the doyens of cooking in South Africa, from the Sharon Glass, the Karen Malamed, Dolores Fleisher, Nita Digutine in Lithuania, and special appearances by Patsy and Ronnie Kaplan making chrein and haroset and all the things good for Pesach. So that is the headline.
Well, all I can say is Dina and I were on a call with Nida in Lithuania on Friday talking about what she's going to make. And there's this most incredible Lithuanian Ashkenazi dish called herring under the blanket. And Nida's going to be making a Pesach Tech version of that for us on Wednesday evening. But Ruth Wasserman Lande, welcome. Lovely to see you. Let's unmute you.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
So, Ruth, I was actually wondering, South Africans in the Israeli Knesset is not a common thing. Have there, in fact, been any other South Africans in the Knesset since Abe Ban in the 1960s and 70s?
Well, from the research that I've done, and I think Gil Hoffman from the Jerusalem Post, there have not been. To put me in one line with Abba even is a huge, on the one hand, it's presumptuous, on the other hand, it's a huge honor. So no, I don't think so, to answer your question.
So we were just talking about Lithuania. Your family comes from Lithuania, stopped by Israel. You landed up and grew up in Cape Town.
My family did it the other way around, as opposed to most of the Jewish people living in South Africa that originated from Lithuania and came probably in the 1930s, more or less. My parents made Aliyah to Israel in the early 1970s. And yes, we moved when I was a child to Cape Town. I grew up there and I made Aliyah on my own when I was 17 at the end of high school.
So you were in fact a graduate of Herzliya High School in Cape Town?
Yes, I was. Yes.
And we believe you still have strong and good relationships with the Kaplinskis.
A little bird told you that. I love Soli Kaplinsky. I completely look up to him. His daughter Ronit is a very, very good friend of mine. We keep in close contact here in Israel for years. And yes, it makes me feel like home, I must say.
Well, we're going to be talking to you about two things tonight. We're going to be talking to you about an amazing webinar we're having tomorrow evening about Isaac Ochberg and the Ochberg list. We're going to be talking to you a little bit just after 8 o'clock about that, because we have an amazing webinar tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, we're going to be talking about Israeli elections. But before we do that, Paula Slier, good evening. Welcome. We have to unmute you. You know, you're a media person. That's the first thing. Plug in the microphone.
Thank you very much for having me, Howard.
So, Paula, also, you're going to do a double act tonight and tomorrow. Elections tonight, Ochberg tomorrow, because you are, in fact, the descendant of an Ochberg orphan.
Correct. My grandmother, Sarah, her maiden name was Altuska, came with her two sisters and brother from the Belarusian city of Brest-Litovsk, exactly 100 years ago, 1921. They were picked up by Isaac Ochberg. At that time, they were living on the streets and sleeping in the synagogue at night. So she didn't want to tell us much about her story. And actually today I found a photograph from the 50th anniversary that was held 1971 in Cape Town. So it's amazing to think that now we're celebrating the 100th anniversary. My, how time goes fast.
And of course, you owe your life, as do about 4,000 people, all descendants of Ochberg orphans rescued in 1921 by Isaac Ochberg, really the Jewish Schindler, and brought as orphans to South Africa, nearly 200 orphans that were half left in Cape Town and half left in Johannesburg, and who were enormously successful and ultimately gave birth to people like yourself. But Paula, people will know you originally from the South African Broadcasting Corporation, where they unceremoniously fired you because they thought that Jews were not permitted to report from the Middle East. But it seemed to be fine with the Russians. And you are now an international war correspondent and Middle Eastern correspondent for Russian TV based out of Tel Aviv.
Well, the amazing thing is when I worked at the SABC, I mean, the SABC for years has been falling apart. I think it's falling apart now. And I think it was falling apart when I worked there some 15 years ago. And we used to joke, those of us who were working there, where does one get a job after you leave the SABC? So apparently you get a job with a Russian network broadcasting in English based in the Middle East. And I don't speak a word of Russian. It's always what people ask me. And I actually remember once, I've just gone blank, the BBC world editor, Simpson. I remember him coming up to me once and we were both reporting on the same story. And he said to me, you speak English with the most beautiful accent and it doesn't sound Russian at all. And I said, well, that's because I'm not. It's a South African accent.
You know, you say this, but I was watching some of the video clips that we'll be playing tomorrow night on the Ochberg Orphans, and your sister, who lives in London, speaks, but she sounds like she was born in London. Not a South African tinge to that accent at all.
I know. And that, you know, she says words like gosh and all these kind of British expressions. And yet she grew up in South Africa. I find that when I talk to South Africans, my accent becomes much more South Africanized. And then when I'm on TV, I mean, unconsciously, and I don't know if I'm doing it now as well, one puts on a little bit of a slightly posher accent. It's not conscious. And I mean, I went for years and years of elocution training. And then I meet someone and they go, you're South African. And I'm like, well, what happened to all those years of training? Didn't achieve much.
Well, I see Linda Beale in the chat section says I'm too loud. Now, Linda, a lot of people have been saying that for many, many years, but you can always turn down your volume. That shouldn't stop you. So a huge welcome to everyone. The time has just gone 8 o'clock. I hope everyone had a really good Shabbos. Guten Woch to all of you. We'd love to know where in the world you're watching us from. We've had lots of interest. People are watching us tonight on 2 different channels on Facebook, as well as on YouTube, as well as on Zoom. And we're expecting an audience of many thousands of people watching us this evening. So interest in the Israeli elections is certainly absolutely top of mind for many in the Jewish community and for many who follow politics, the Middle East, very, very carefully. So welcome to a remarkable panel of people this evening. And as we always do, let us remind you that you should be picking up a copy of the South African Jewish Report. I hope you're all looking at, those of you who are out of South Africa, I hope you're all looking at it on the web, www.sajr.co.za. This week's edition, Danny, if you put on the screen, let's hope you will actually do that, deals with the Chief Justice of South Africa, who the Judicial Services Commission has ordered to apologize for his support for Israel, saying that the Chief Justice has no right to a political opinion at all. It's a very interesting story, and I urge you all to go pick up a copy of the Jewish Report at your local Spar shop, your Pick and Pay, your Checkers, your Exclusive Books, CNA, your Garage shop. We distribute through over 200 locations around South Africa. But if you can't get your physical copy, go on to www.sajr.co.za and pick up a copy. We've got a brand new website there. It's mobile friendly as well. So there's no reason that you shouldn't be completely 100% up to date with what's happening in South African Jewry, world Jewry, Israel, and everything happening around the world. I think we have the best editor in South Africa, and I do believe we actually produce the best publication in all of South Africa. Because for those of you who will remember the remnants of the Star newspaper, the Pretoria News, the Cape Times, the Cape Argus, I have only two words to say, and they're in Yiddish, and it goes, Oya Klog. So please get your copy of the Jewish Report newspaper. And Dina Diamond, you have a webinar coming up on Wednesday. It's pre-Pesach again. Tell us what you're doing.
Absolutely. Can you believe that we are at Pesach again? I mean, now, again, I know everyone's written about it, but we're at a full year from our COVID lockdown. So last time we didn't have to entertain. So this time people are entertaining a bit more. So you want to impress your guests. And how do you do that? You take expert skill from the best cooks in the country. So we have got Sharon Glass, Dolores Fleisher, Karen Malamed, and we also went abroad and got Nida, because we know that Howard loves his herring. And there is a special dish called herring in a blanket that is coming all the way from Lithuania to delight your table. So hopefully people will even try that. And we're also going to try and help you make your charoset and your grain with Patsy from Fagels and Ronnie Kaplan. And they're going to actually mince the grain. They're going to show you how it is truly done, the charoset, and I think we may even throw in a knedel recipe. So it is going to be a full packed lineup of how to impress your guests this Pesach.
That's absolutely amazing, Dina. Thank you so much. So look forward to that. That's coming up very, very shortly on Wednesday. But before that, actually, we have one more webinar. And in fact, Paula, you and Ruth have both been involved in the story of the Ochberg Orphans. Paula, tell us about that.
Well, my involvement has really just been the fact that I was born to an Ochberg. I am an Ochberg descendant. My grandmother, Sarah Altuska, came with her two sisters and her brother in 1921, exactly 100 years ago. They were rescued by a Ukrainian Jew who was living in South Africa, made his fortunes in South Africa, Isaac Ochberg. And he managed to rescue just under 200 Jewish orphans. So myself, my father, who was my grandmother's son, all the descendants. I think today there's something like 3,000 or 4,000 of us. We owe our lives to this remarkable man. And Ruth has been much more involved in actually setting up the commemoration. Ruth, if you want to say a few words.
Ruth, let's unmute you.
I had a bit of a problem with the with the camera. My story is that I began working and advising strategically to the local and regional council of Megiddo. I would say in was it 2020? And my very first meeting at the regional council was with the mayor, of course, and two people. The two people began to talk, and the first thing that I heard was, of course, the very famous South African accent, and of course, I felt right at home. Next, they mentioned, and you mentioned him as well, Sali Kaplinski, and that was it. Since that very moment, I was completely hooked, and they began to tell me that they have created an international committee to commemorate a man about whom I have heard absolutely nothing. And there was a commemoration site in the Megiddo Regional Council. This man had saved hundreds of Jewish orphans from Ukraine in 1919 to 1921. And I immediately felt that this was a story that was sort of embodying tikkun olam, Jewish values, something that connects the Jewish diaspora in Israel, something that is beautiful and encompasses a lot of hope. And I began to research together with Peter Bailey and with David Kaplan and others who were involved in this committee. And ever since then, and until today, very strongly, I found myself extremely committed to this issue, both for the sake of the Regional Council of Megiddo, but also for the sake of this beautiful and impactful human interest story that is very unusual, and I would say is the epitome of Jewish tikkun olam.
So Ruth, let's actually watch a very short little trailer about what we're going to be doing tomorrow night.
Sure.
It was 1921, before Hitler, before Stalin. They lived in the most dangerous of times, in the most dangerous of places, and they were just vulnerable children.
Things were very hard there.
I was an animal, I wasn't a human being.
We were the lucky ones.
One man made it his mission to save them.
To bring our children, put himself into danger. He was much more than just an ordinary man.
So if you haven't registered, Danny will post the registration links in the chat section on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Zoom. So please register, and we'll see you at 7 p.m. tomorrow evening. But with that, importantly this evening, we have the Israeli elections coming up, the 4th elections in 2 years. Paula Slier, is this a sign that Israel democracy is not working, that there has never been a majority government in Israel, that every government is always a coalition, and over the last 2 years, coalitions just haven't worked, and we're going to the 4th elections in Israel in that very short period of time?
Well, Howard, it could be a question that democracy doesn't work, or it could be a question that there's actually too much democracy and perhaps democracy does work. I mean, it depends who you ask and how you look at it. I want you to start off by saying that, interestingly enough, today, this very date, the 13th of March, is exactly 15 years that Netanyahu has been prime minister in Israel. As we all know, he's served longer than any other prime minister. He overtook David Ben-Gurion, who only served some 13 years. And as a journalist, I've been talking to a lot of people on the streets, asking them what these elections mean and what's the mood here in Israel. And we'll see whether or not the panelists agree with me, but the general sense I get is that people are tired of elections. This is an election that's coming during coronavirus, so there are some concerns in terms of how safe it is in that respect. I would say that people are feeling apathetic. I would say that a lot of issues are not being discussed, and that just like the previous elections, this is an election actually about one man. Do you support Netanyahu or don't you support Netanyahu? Now, just to give some background, technically the last government collapsed on the 22nd of December because Netanyahu refused to approve a budget for 2020. Now, he blamed Gantz, which was his coalition partner, and he said that that was because Gantz refused to allow Netanyahu, the prime minister, any say in a series of coming government and judicial appointments. Now, Gantz blamed Netanyahu, and opinion polls actually put most Israelis blaming Netanyahu as well for the reason why we're going back to another cycle of elections. And talking to analysts in the country, a lot of them say that this is for Netanyahu's advantage, that we have elections. He's managed to push his criminal trial to after the elections, and he's in a much stronger position to fight the charges that he faces sitting in the seat of a prime minister than rather not sitting in a seat of a prime minister. And analysts here are saying that he's prepared to go round after round after round of election just as a means of holding on to power. But certainly in answer to your question more directly, in terms of how is the Israeli electoral system set up and whether or not this is a fault of democracy, you have a situation here in Israel where no single party has ever been able to win an outright majority in the 120-seat Knesset. And certainly the polls predict that this coming election later this month is not going to be any different. Now, you have a system of politics here in Israel where you have nationwide proportional representation. So what this means actually is that minor political parties are actually given disproportionate leverage, and very often you have your larger parties having to form coalitions with these smaller ones. And as I say again, we're going to have that scenario repeated come the 23rd of March. So the Israelis exasperated, but certainly I still think you're going to see large numbers going to the polls, because whether we have another election after this or not, each election has increasingly become an election about whether or not to keep Netanyahu in power.
So Arthur Lenk, you were you Israeli ambassador to South Africa. You served here for a long period of time. You obviously today have your own personal views, but we're not going to talk about your personal views. If people do want to see your personal views, we've covered stories about them in the Jewish Report in South Africa. You've been very vocal about where you stand. You also have a Twitter account. If people want to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
Arthur Lenk.
Arthur Lenk, simple enough. But Arthur, are Israelis, as we say in South Africa, chatful? Have they just had enough? Can you muster any enthusiasm at all this time around?
No, I don't think there's any enthusiasm. I don't think that anybody's excited to vote again. That said, I think that Paula is right in what she said, that one, it's clear that the central question is not war and peace. It's not the Palestinians. It's not Iran. It's Mr. Netanyahu. And I have to say that my 4 years in your beautiful country, where you've never had coalitions, where one party has ruled for 26 years. 6 years now, there's advantages to coalition. And one of the real advantages is that everybody, and this time, it's clear that every single tribe in Israel, whether it's the Arabs or the left or the Russians or the secular or the religious or the ultra-Orthodox or the settlers or any group, feels like they have a chance to be in. And it might happen to any or all of them. But what's really, really interesting is I have a Venn graph almost that I want to share, if that's okay.
Sure.
Let's see if we can get it open here. Okay, this is all of the different 13 parties that have a realistic chance of making it in, and all the parties that are inside the shape are the ones who are pro-Bibi, and all the ones outside are anti-Bibi and say that they won't serve with him. Interestingly, there are two parties that are half in and half out. Mr. Bennett's Yamina party, and interestingly, a religious Arab party has had this interesting dialogue with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Likud. So it's rather than the past elections or historically, where it seemed like, are you for peace or against peace? Are you want to talk to the Palestinians? Don't want to talk to the Palestinians? Do you like a Camp David peace process or another? This time, and Paula said it in her first words, it's, do you think that Mr. Netanyahu should continue as the leader of the state of Israel? Yes or no?
So Arthur, just for those of us who failed the Jewish day school in South Africa, help us with some of this Hebrew writing on the screen. Who is in the octagon?
Okay, inside the circle, the first party in the upper right is the Likud.
That's Bibi Netanyahu's party.
Certainly the largest party in Israel according to surveys. Along with him there's a very, very conservative right-wing party called Religious Zionism, a new party that Mr. Netanyahu himself seemed to put together with, in my point of view, a number of very, very racist elements in it. Beyond that, there are two ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and Torah Judaism, that they have been the core of Prime Minister Netanyahu's partnership, his coalition for years and years and years, and it seems to be ironclad. Outside the octagon, as you say, I don't think that we have 8, but outside the shape, if we start on the upper, on the left, on the very top is Yair Lapid's party, Yesh Atid, which is the second largest party in Israel according to surveys. Kahol Lavan, which is interesting, is Mr. Gantz's, General Gantz's party, and had been a huge party and with over 30 seats in the last election, and current surveys have them at 4 or 5, just barely making it into Knesset. Also in that grouping is the Labor Party and Meretz, and 2 different Arab parties, the United Arab List and a religious list that had ran with all of the Arab parties together last time, but has split away, partly because he's seen a place for a dialogue with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Also, on the top in the middle of the screen is the Russian party, Mr. Lieberman's party, Israel Beitenu, Israel is our home. And really interestingly, this time, Prime Minister Netanyahu has 2 challenges from the right. The New Hope Party, led by Gideon Sa'ar, a former member of the Likud, and Yamina, Naftali Bennett's party, who says that he wants to unseat Mr. Netanyahu, but also seems to hint that if the situation is right, he'll go with Netanyahu too, which is why I put him half in and half out. So it's really interesting that normally one would think that we would put the line right down the middle, but in March 2021, that's not the way.
So, Paula Slier, just before we go and speak to all the political parties, just to check a few things, you don't vote for a prime minister in Israel, you vote for a party, similar to that in South Africa. There are only 120 seats in the Knesset. But if you get 1% or 1.1%, you don't, in fact, get into the Knesset. There's a minimum threshold you have to get above in order to make sure that very small parties don't get in. Am I correct in saying that threshold is 3.5%?
I think it's 3.75, if I'm not mistaken.
3.25.
3.25%.
Yeah.
So you have to get at least 3% of the votes in order to get any representation in Parliament. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Emmanuel?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to some of the political parties, and the party that dominates Israel's politics at the moment is the Likud party. So, Paul, a big welcome to you. You are, in fact, from the chairman of the Likud Anglo division. Fantastic to have you with us. Your prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, is he a visionary leader or is he a crook?
Well, I think the crook part's a big joke. I'll tell you in a minute why, but he's a visionary. Look, he's done a lot for Israel. In 2003, he saved the country financially as the finance minister. Now we have we are the first ones in the coronavirus to have vaccinated the majority of the population, and he is a visionary in what he did by making a deal with Pfizer and getting the vaccine early. We now have the visionary man. We have the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem and other countries following there. We have the Abraham Accords, which is probably extremely important, where we have 5 Arab countries now are recognizing Israel, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and others. And soon we hope to have Saudi Arabia in the fold. And many African countries are now coming to Israel. They understand that they get nothing from the PLO or Hamas or Iran. Israel offers them technology and growth and things good for their people. The rest of the political parties that were shown, what did they offer? They don't offer anything except anybody but Bibi. Okay, and I don't exactly agree. New Hope is not a party on the right. New Hope is actually a party on the left. Gideon Sa'ar is on the left. The leftist people that were in the Likud were malcontents. They went with him. They were also basically on the left. And what they're trying to do is draw votes by saying they're on the right, away from the right, so that they can join the coalition with Yair Lapid, who will say anything to get votes for himself and his party to get to be prime minister. But they don't, none of them offer a visionary anything for anything. Meretz, you have on the left, you know, they just endorsed the ICC wartime investigations against Israel. So, you know, these parties, it's really a battle between whether we're going to go ahead with a right-wing government or we're going to go backwards with a left-wing government. But the big
well, Paul, let's stop there for a moment, because we've heard that Bibi's been prime minister now for the longest period of time of any prime minister in Israel's history. So the question really is: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We can't get away from the fact that the prime minister is facing criminal charges for bribery, corruption, breach of trust. Are those all politically motivated? Are they very minor? Or is there a legitimate basis for that? Is he potentially guilty?
They are all politically corrupt. You know, we have a very big overreach of the Supreme Court. It dates back to the days of the Bolsheviks. How did they get elected? They aren't elected. Some committee meets and they appoint the Supreme Court. And in the past, the Supreme Court justices were re-elected. When they retired, they would choose their own replacement. So the Supreme Court doesn't represent the people. It has overreach, and they prosecute and go after people that they don't want to see in the government. 12 years they were after Lieberman, and they dropped the charges after 12 years. I want to ask you a question. If Bibi retired today and he went on a tour of the United States, what would he make? 50 million, 70 million? And they're charging him with corruption because he supposedly accepted over a few years too many cigars. I mean, some of these charges are absolutely absurd. People that should be prosecuted, they don't. Right now, the Supreme Court will not release their files that they have in the past for for doing favors for people in the court. They won't release their files. So the big problem dates back even longer. It dates back to the times when we were basically a socialist country, and we are slowly changing in that. We are a very successful high-tech country. The UAE yesterday just announced they're going to invest $10 billion. They set up a fund to invest $10 billion in Israel. So when you say these things, it's ridiculous. What is it that Bibi? Tell me. You say that he's corrupt or somebody else. What did he do that's corrupt? Did he take money for himself or something? No. I mean, it's Bibi. It's
okay, great.
Anybody but Bibi campaign. They have nothing to say, and Bibi has been a visionary and brought the country and leading the country forward.
Okay, so Paul, also in government, in coalition with the Likud, is the Blue and White Party. Ruth, that's your party. You're a member of Knesset for Blue and White. A deal was done.
The Blue and White Party is a member.
Okay, of Paul. Okay, Paul. Let's talk to Ruth. So, Ruth, General Benny Gantz, went into coalition with Netanyahu. Was he betrayed?
You know, first of all, I admire every word that Paul has said. Having said that, I want to first say that the $10 billion foundation that we're talking about is a mutual UAE and Israeli foundation for mutual projects. And one cannot take away the amazing achievement, game-changing achievement that the Netanyahu administration, together with the Trump administration, has achieved for Israel in terms of the Abraham Accords. Having said that, Gantz entered the coalition in an absolutely apolitical manner. In other words, if anybody needs any proof of that, one can see what the ambassador has said, from 35 mandates to 5-6 mandates, depending on what day you are polling. So understanding that, he nevertheless entered the current coalition. Why did he do that? He did this, in his view, in our view, in fact, to make sure that there are checks and balances to decision-making in the political arena. Today, being in the Knesset, sitting in no less than 9 commissions, 9 committees, different committees, convening despite the very challenging times on emergency issues like Corona, like decision-making in whether people can go out of Israel, can come into Israel, and so on. I understand, I feel, I touch, I sense, I live in those committees, reading and understanding what the discussions are about. I can testify personally that the presence of blue and white within the coalition is nothing less than critical. That's not to say that Netanyahu is good or bad. I feel that this is a very superficial manner in which to view Israeli politics, which are very complex, but rather, as you say, 15 years of leadership is something that cannot go a longer way without checks and balances. This is the nature. This is the epitome of democracy. The reason why we're in this government is to make sure that checks and balances are in place. And if they were not there, very, very unilateral, not always completely correct decisions would be made for the country. And I'm saying this very gently. And is the Gantz presence within the current coalition something to punish the blue and white party for? On the very contrary. As I said, he did an almost altruistic step in stepping into the coalition. Is he as rhetorically brilliant as Netanyahu? No. But did he take an altruistic step for the sake of Israel and not for political sake, which is very obvious? Absolutely, yes, for the sake of the country and for the good of the country. Now, what will happen?
So Ruth, can I interrupt there? Because there would be many who would say that he was in coalition with Yesh Atid, and in fact, he stepped into a position betraying Yesh Atid in order to gain personal political advantage in the political situation, that he in fact betrayed Yair Lapid, and he's getting what comes to him as a result of that. He is the one who kept Bibi Netanyahu in power.
He kept Bibi Netanyahu in power, but let me just correct the stereotype. I mean, politics and, slogans are very easy to put out. There's a dispute about who betrayed whom. And this dispute is no longer secret. There was no betrayal there. Also, there was no real possibility, number-wise. He did not have a majority to create an alternative government because there were 3 people in that bigger group that were forcefully resisting any kind of government with the Arab mutualist. And that was the reason that he actually entered, not to gain a seat, because he very obviously lost a huge number of seats, a huge number of mandates, and a lot of popularity. People were very angry with him, and he knew that. He knew that because his main issue was, I will not sit with Netanyahu, and that's exactly what he did. He knew he was making a hugely unpopular step. And the story is a little bit different. There were 3 people in that bigger coalition that were not agreeing at all to come into a government with the Arab parties. Thereby, if he had not entered the government, we would have gone to another election in which the polls showed that the Bibi Netanyahu-led government would have a huge majority, thereby having absolutely no checks and balances on democracy. And that is what Benny Gantz stepped into the government to prevent.
So Ruth, this may be an enormously insensitive question to ask, but realistically, the way the opinion polls are going, is it likely that you are actually unemployed come the 23rd of this month?
Okay, so I wasn't born a diplomat, and I love undiplomatic questions. I spent 3 years in Cairo. Had I had a problem with undiplomatic questions, I would have died there. But as an Israeli Jewish woman and a diplomat, the epitome of all evil. So unemployed, don't worry about me. I'll survive. I wasn't born a diplomat. I just want to say that, first of all, we really are very sure from internal polls and external polls, but particularly from internal polls, that we shall cross the threshold. That's first of all. Second of all, if there will be another transit government, and as Paula had mentioned at the beginning, there's a big chance of that, because there is a difficulty, an inherent difficulty in the current coalition system in Israel, and there's a very big chance of no party being able to really create a new government, and thereby making this terrible situation and never-ending transit government continue. There's a huge importance to blue and white being in. Why? Because there is still the agreement between Likud and the blue and white party, whereby half of the ministers are blue and white, thereby ensuring in any transit government that there are checks and balances, ensuring democracy. That is, again, not to say that the Likud is doing everything bad. I'm the last person to say that. But having just Likud there and the right-wing parties and the right-wing coalition is very one-sided, and very specific laws will be passed in a transit government. And we've seen that from within, from inside. As I mentioned, 9 committees. Very difficult to imagine if blue and white will not be there in a transit situation, what the Israeli democracy will look like.
Right. Well, you've told us that. I want to move over to Gideon Saar's party, New Hope. Emmanuel Navon, good evening. Erev Tov, welcome to you. You are, in fact, an expert on international relations. You've recently written a book. Tell us very briefly about that book.
It's called The Star and the Scepter, a diplomatic history of Israel, published by Jewish Publication Society and University Press of Nebraska. A 500-page book that covers 3,000 years of diplomatic history. It's the only book that covers all aspects of Israeli foreign policy, but gives it also a very wide historical perspective.
So Danny, in a moment, will put the link on all of our channels for people who want to order a copy. A copy is available, I presume, through Amazon. You can get it for your Kindle. I don't know if it's physically available yet in South Africa. I'm sure it's a remarkable read. But you're close to Gideon Saar, and his party comes out of the Likud party. What does it actually stand for?
Well, let me reply to what Paul said about this party, which is completely wrong. Completely wrong. I would like to react to the false allegations made by Paul. Gideon Saar has been a member of Likud since his young age. I myself was a member of Likud for about 20 years. Gideon Saar was at the side of Benjamin Netanyahu when Netanyahu lost his first election in 1999. And when the Likud lost the election of 2006 with only 12 seats, Gideon Saar was at the side of Netanyahu, rebuilt the party from the opposition. And he's actually at the right of Netanyahu. When Paul said Tikva Chadasha, or New Hope, is a left-wing party, this is a lie. I'm sorry to use that word, but that's the only word. It is a lie. There's nothing wrong with being left-wing, of course. But Gideon Saar is at the right of Netanyahu. Netanyahu voted in favor of disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005 in the Knesset. Gideon Saar voted against. Gideon Saar is the only member of Likud who managed to make, you mentioned, Paul, the Supreme Court, by making the unbased claim that the charges against Netanyahu are political. That is also wrong. The same court indicted a left-wing prime minister, Ehud Olmert, and many left-wing prime ministers, politicians in Israel. To say that it is politicized only when it is against Netanyahu is disingenuous and wrong. We are a democracy that abides by the rule of law, and only the court would decide whether or not Netanyahu is corrupt. But it is not politically motivated. Gideon Saar, as I said, is the only politician on the right who promoted a reform of the nomination of the judges of the Supreme Court when he was a young MK in 2006. Netanyahu, 15 years as prime minister, not only has not promoted a single reform of the legal system, he has blocked them. When Likud came back to power in 2009, thanks to Gideon Saar, and Gideon Saar wanted to separate the powers of the Attorney General. Netanyahu blocked the reform, and he has prided himself of blocking every reform of the judicial system, which he criticizes today only because he has been indicted. Now, it is also wrong what Paul said that Tikva Hadasha is all about everything but Bibi. This is not true. This is not true. As a matter of fact, Tikva Hadasha has a very, very detailed platform that addresses all aspects of Israel's political life, political reform, limiting the term of the prime minister to 8 years, changing the voting system, addressing economic reforms. As opposed to Likud, by the way, I was a member of Likud for 18 years. Likud does not have a platform. Go on the website of Likud. Since 2009, Likud has no platform. It is Likud which is only about Bibi. It has nothing to do with conservatism. It has nothing to do with being right-wing. Bibi, besides voting in favor of disengaging from the Gaza Strip in 2005, has freed thousands of terrorists with blood on their hands. He's the one who has preserved the Histadrut, who has preserved the legal system without conducting any reform. He is the one who has preserved all the monopolies in the Israeli economy. He talks a lot about free markets. He has done very little about it. And this is exactly why Gideon Saar left, because Netanyahu is the one who brought us to this political crisis. There is a majority in Israel for the right, but there's no majority for Netanyahu, which is why we keep going to those elections. And Netanyahu had a government with blue and white. He decided in cold blood to block the passing of a budget and to take us to a fourth election in 2 years. This is a man that I used to admire and that I no longer admire because he used to be a great leader. Paul mentioned the fact that Netanyahu, the only time he took a courageous decision when he was Minister of Finance between 2003 and 2005. Yes, he made very courageous decisions. He has done great things for Israel, especially in foreign policy. We recognize and salute his extraordinary foreign policy record. But in the past 2 years, unfortunately, he's putting the interest, his personal interest, before the interest of the country. And this is why Gideon Saar took the very courageous step of challenging him, saying this man, which I supported in the past, is no longer can no longer be prime minister of Israel because he's holding the country hostage for his personal political survival, which is why we're presenting an alternative to the country, saying you don't have to be Bibi in order to be on the right. And if you want to have a government led by the center right, and you don't want Netanyahu, you have an alternative with a very, very detailed platform, as opposed to Likud, which doesn't have one.
So, I mean, Emmanuel, it's very interesting because we seem to be fighting over who best represents the right. There seems to be very little center within the politics that we're talking about. So I want to move probably slightly further to the right. Rabbi Yishai Fleisher, you join us from Hebron this evening. Tell us about that image behind you.
That is the tomb of the forefathers and mothers in Hebron. It is a beautiful site which has the remains of our ancestors from 3,800 years ago. And 2,000 years ago, King Herod, a Jewish king, a strange Jewish king, but a Jewish king nonetheless, built this monumental building. And Jewish people have been living in Hebron in perpetuity, almost without stop, for the last 3,500 years, with, of course, King David starting his kingdom there because it was the capital of Judah, and then moving to Jerusalem. And famous people, important people, including Maimonides, coming to visit. And we have, in a regular non-corona year, about 1 million visitors, 1 million plus now with the advent of more Islamic visitation, Jews from all over the world and Christians, people who are interested in the way of Abraham.
So Yishai, who are you going to be voting for come the 23rd of March?
Well, the good news is that people who have a nationalist outlook, so-called right-wing nationalist outlook, have a lot of options. And I think that we started off this program with a whole heap of cynicism. This whole thing is about Netanyahu and Netanyahu's indictment, all that kind of stuff, you know, and that people are cynical and that people are not excited about this election. I see it differently. I see that we have a lot of big issues that we want to tackle, and we want to continue to see the Abraham Accords flourish and maybe move it over to add Saudi Arabia into that. We want to see more liberalization of the economy, getting rid of more bureaucracy. We want Israel to continue its techie kind of push it to the world. We want to see our Navy get bigger so that we could protect Greece and from Turkey, if we can patrol Cyprus and our gas fields there, and also all the way to the UAE, protect them from Iran. So Israel's got a lot of big missions coming up. And if you're a nationalist voter, I think what Emmanuel said now made a lot of sense to me. You've got a lot of options. You've got we're looking towards a Knesset that's going to have 80 out of 120, 80 right-wing nationalist-leaning Knesset members. This shows not just something about the Knesset, but something about the people of Israel, who are pretty much done with left-leaning ideology that is land giveaway, land surrender, and basically kowtowing to folks who want to undermine Israel as a Jewish state, as our security. And so there's going to be 80 seats. Now, what the coalition is going to look like is not exactly going to be 80 seats, because people have their politics. But Gideon Sa'ar, for example, is, as Emmanuel Navon I think said very correctly, a nationalist candidate, and so is Lieberman of the Russian party. So you have a lot of folks that may not be in the coalition, but are still part of a nationalist outlook, and I think that's fabulous, because that's the outlook that the people that I represent have and share. For myself, I'm excited about the party that was badly besmirched earlier in the program, which is the Religious Zionist Party. Religious Zionism is a big movement here in Israel, and it represents not just folks that are so-called settlers, who are religious and non-religious as well, but also people who believe in the ideology that combines a love of the state of Israel and also a love of Judaism and of the kind of Jewish character of the state of Israel. So that's the Religious Zionist Party. We're hoping that party will have 5 seats. And if it does, it'll also include some great folks like Bezalel Smotrich and Orit Struk, who are great parliamentarians. And we'll move to make sure that the 100 million euros that are dedicated by the European Union and the Germans and others to create anti-Israel propaganda and anti-Israel organizations here in Israel and around the world, and also Palestinian land theft of Area C, that's going to be stopped, and that Israel is going to be a democratic state, but first and foremost a Jewish state, because Israel is the national liberation movement's country for the Jewish people. It's our ethnic national state, and we have to protect that from forces that want to dilute that and to hurt that. So that's the party that I'm excited about, but that doesn't mean that's the only party I'm excited about. As a spokesman for the Jewish community of Hebron, I'm looking for a coalition, a nationalist coalition. It's going to be Netanyahu. It's going to be the ultra-Orthodox parties. It's going to be the religious Zionist parties. It's going to be Bennett. And who knows, maybe Gideon Sa'ar himself or members of his
absolutely
party.
No.
Okay,
absolutely
so
not.
that's fine. So that's his choice. That's his choice, and we'll see, because we heard the same thing from Blue and White, but that's not what happened in the end. But we'll see what happens. But right now, the way the numbers look from the Channel 11 poll that was released this evening, it looks like that the Netanyahu coalition, the classic coalition, is at 63 seats. Just by I'm not predicting that. I'm just giving you what Can 11's prediction is. And so we're looking forward to that kind of nationalist government, and we're looking for 4 solid years of work to move the country ahead, and not cynicism, but Zionism, not cynicism. A little bit of excitement about the Jewish project. Today is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. It's the first day of the new month of Nisan. We're coming up to Pesach. So I think that we should be just a tad more positive about the outlook, the future of Israel, this incredible country that was born a little over 70 years ago and really coming into its own at this time.
Well, Yishai, you speak about 2 things. You speak about Jewish, you speak about democratic. But in essence, there's the third ingredient in that. There's an issue of land, an issue of democracy, and an issue of Judaism. Mm-hmm. And you can't have all 3. You have to make some decisions, some very hard decisions. Mm-hmm. And if you're Jewish and democratic, you have to give up land. If you keep land and want to be Jewish, you have to give up democracy. But we can't just throw these terms out of Jewish, democratic, and think that we can't factor into this third factor, because there are other people in that land as well. And those people aren't going to the polls on the 23rd. And we're going to come back and talk about some of these really hard issues straight after we've had a break, because tonight's broadcast is in fact sponsored by 2 people. It's sponsored by Hold, because there are so many South Africans who are looking for a second home within Israel. And Hold, in fact, are one of those companies that assist you from the moment go right the way through, whether you're making Aliyah or alternatively looking for a second property and a second home in Israel. Hold are really your answer. Danny, let's hear from them quickly.
Where is home? Is it the place where we're born? Is it where we see ourselves retiring? For Jews around the world, Israel, the Holy Land, will always be the place we belong. Let us find your perfect home. Because we realize that purchasing property is just the beginning of the journey, and everything that comes afterwards can be a little overwhelming. Our team will hold your hand throughout the process. Legal services, opening bank accounts, organizing mortgages, project management and post-sales management of the property, including finding tenants and managing your apartment. You can trust that with over 20 years experience and backed by the biggest development companies in Israel, our team is focused exclusively on representing the unique needs of our buyers. Anything is possible, and we will make your dream a reality. Talk to us about finding and securing your future property in Israel.
So Paula Slier, in previous elections, if you go back 10 years or more, the issue of Palestinians was really the central issue that people discussed when it comes to Israel. And before you answer that, what we're doing is we're just running a poll. If anyone would like to get hold to talk about owning property in Israel, please just mark on the screen and we'll get someone from Hold to actually give you a shout, because they have property all over Israel in all sorts of price brackets as well. So if it's of any interest to you, please just click yes or no on the poll. I see more than 32 people, 34 people now, 36 people who are all interested in getting information from Hold about buying property in Israel. So as the rand fluctuates up and down, and we've been fairly strong in the last few days, this may be an ideal time for someone to buy some property in Israel. I see Danny's running the wrong poll for us, but we'll take this one as the Hold poll regardless. So, Paula, the issue of Palestinians. Why are we not hearing the Palestinians factor into any of this discussion?
Look, I think following on from what people have said, historically, this is put as the election in Israel that's going to be fought the most on the right. So that is correct what's being said here, and it's correct in terms of the polls and the assessments that are coming out. I still think the number one issue, as the panelists have mentioned, is the issue around Netanyahu. This is an election that is very much less about issues. You ask, why are the Palestinians not a major factor? I think when I talk to ordinary Israelis, most of them are really much more concerned about Netanyahu and the coronavirus. And just on that point, Netanyahu has used the recent pandemic and the way Israel's done so well in his election campaigns. There was actually talk of the CEO of Pfizer coming to Israel this past week, and he subsequently cancelled his trip, and that was partly out of concern that Netanyahu would use that as a photo opportunity to promote his campaign. So in terms of what Israelis are voting for, the Palestinian issue really isn't there. It hasn't been there for quite some time, and as you've heard from the panelists, the parties on the left don't seem to be faring so well. I mean, if we look at the latest assessments in terms of how parties are going to do, you have the joint list, which is your Arab parties, coming with a projected 8 seats. So they're down from how they did in the last election. And you have the Labour Party with some 6 seats. We're talking out of a parliament of 120. You have the Merits and the Blue and White coming in with a projected 4. So that's just above the threshold. So it does give you an indication of where Israelis, where their concerns are and where they're thinking about things. And certainly when I've spoken to Israelis on the streets and done my own kind of polling in terms of what are the important issues, the Palestinian issue is not there amongst them.
So Ambassador Arthur Lenk, is the left dead? Is this a fight between the right and the extreme right? Is there any left?
Well, there is. But that said, I think that what other speakers have said earlier are right, that a significant majority of Knesset members, if were asked their own personal opinions, would lean to the right. That said, there will still be, and it's clear, it's interesting that the Labour Party, which seemed clearly to be dead for the first time since Golda Meir, has a woman leader, and she's brought in some new energy to it. Merav Michaeli. The Russian party has been talking in different terms. Lots of dialogue with different parts, certainly are secular and are interested in rights of Russians who certainly don't see themselves as Orthodox. Meretz has been the Human Rights Party of Israel for 2 generations. There are also 2 Arab parties that are seem to have a significant chance of making it into Knesset. So so tonight we're hearing from an interesting group of people, but we haven't heard, and we're not going to hear this time, from the second largest party in Israel, the Yesh Atid party, which of course will lead a center-left government or a middle-of-the-road government if it's not Netanyahu, because he's the second largest. It will likely be the second largest party in Israel. So Labor and Meretz and the Russian party and the Arab parties, we haven't heard anything about the ultra-Orthodox parties, which it's interesting that they are certainly aligned with Mr. Netanyahu, but they have historically in Israel been willing to sit left or right because of the importance for them of being part of a government, however it comes about. It'll be interesting to see that that balance of the different tribes that exist in Israel, and a coalition allows everybody to have a role to play.
So Arthur, we're not going to hear from Yesh Atid, not because we didn't invite them. In fact, we tried very hard to get them onto the panel. They just said 10 days before an election, there's just no one available. It's a very busy time for them. But Paul, let's go to you and let's ask the question. What is the biggest issue facing Israel?
Biggest issue facing Israel? Iran.
So give us your party's solution. Obviously, we had Donald Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. That seemed to just accelerate Iran's nuclear development. What is the answer? What are you proposing happens in order to neutralize the threat that Iran poses existentially to Israel?
Well, I'm going to start off by actually complimenting General Gantz. You know, in my opinion, he's not a politician, okay, but he's really a good general. And he's been the defense minister, and he's always backed Netanyahu with the defense, and he's also achieved on his own as a defense minister, doing what it was necessary in Syria against the Iranians and everything else. Of course, that's with working with the Likud government, and together we have formed the Abraham Accords, and from my understanding, we are working on a coalition of not only Bahrain, the UAE, but also Israel and Saudi Arabia in an alliance as a front against Iran. Because you see, they're spreading their wings from the I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right, but the Houthis in Yemen. They have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria. You have Syria. You got the Shiites in Iraq, which control the country. And we're not sure where Turkey stands in all this. They're sometimes with Iran, against it. We don't know for sure. So we have to form a strong coalition, an alliance that will counter what Iran is trying to do. And so far, I think we've been successful. Okay.
So Paul, I want to actually stop there, because that alliance has really existed for years. It may have been formalized in the last few months in the Abraham Accords, but the alliance of the anti-Shiite bloc within the Middle East has really existed for many, many years. That hasn't stopped the accelerated development of Iranian nuclear weapons. So what is your party's position of what do you do to stop Iran?
Well, it's both what Bibi Netanyahu and Gantz had said. We'll do whatever whatever is necessary.
So what is necessary?
You know what? We don't know what's necessary until that point comes. When we had to bomb the Iraq nuclear plant, we didn't say, oh, it's necessary to bomb the Iraq nuclear plant, so we're going to do it. You know, some things I'm not privy to, of course, but, you know, some things is not for the general public's information. We can't tell the world or Iran what we plan to do until we see what we actually do. But we do give hints that if they do this and that we're going to act. And that is a big deterrent.
Okay, so let's ask Ruth. Ruth, your party is in government as well. Practically, what does that actually mean? How is Iran the biggest issue facing Israel, or is that just a smokescreen? And if it is, what do we do about that? Or if there are other bigger issues, what would you select as your one big issue?
So, first of all, just to let you all know, there's a very big Zoom webinar this evening, in fact, with Benny Gantz speaking about Iran tonight. So certainly one cannot say that this is a negligent issue. It's not by far the only issue, but of course it's a strategic.
I didn't say only issue. I said the most important issue facing.
I'm not saying that you had said that. I'm just saying it is the only issue, but it is one of the main issues, and certainly all the tools are on the table, so to speak. But of course, a military solution is the very last option, and yet kept on the table. And that was said by Benny Gantz as well. I just want to mention another country which is very, very important in the equation, and that is Jordan. Very small country, and yet extremely important security-wise, policy-wise, in terms of anti-Islamic movements and so on. A very sensitive country. And the monarchy there is in a very sensitive position. And I would beg to argue that Netanyahu has not paid enough attention, perhaps, to this particular part of the equation in the last couple of years. And I think testimony to that is the fact that the Jordanians have recently not allowed Netanyahu's plane to fly over their airspace in order to reach the UAE, thereby cancelling the very recent trip that was planned by Prime
In fact, this
Minister
past week, there was a major diplomatic tiff between Israel and Jordan.
Exactly. That is
That
something
had to
that
do with the prince trying to bring in soldiers.
Yeah,
into
Paul, allow Ruth to talk, please.
Please. That is something that Benny Gantz has worked very hard behind. He just does that, a lot behind the scenes. I agree with the analysis that he's not a politician. I see that as, of course, an advantage. He does completely apolitical things, almost, I would say, antagonistic to his own popularity, but very much in advantage to Israel's value and worth. And I would say a few more things that I think are very important. One, somebody said that there are 80 seats out of 120 that are right wing, but it's a little bit misleading to put it very gently, because very many of those seats will simply not sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Again, I don't say it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just stating the fact that there are very far from 80 seats to make a coalition with the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, because like Saar, like the head of Yesh Atid, like the head of Israel Beitenu, these people that have previously sat with Prime Minister Netanyahu will quite honestly rather die than do it again. They refused to do it. Again, not good, not bad, but worthwhile mentioning to a public that perhaps is a little bit less aware. And another thing that everybody mentioned is the fact that Israeli politics leans to the right. There's no question about it. Israeli public is leaning to the right. There is a weakening, a constant weakening of the left, and yet center, there is very much a center, and that is Yesh Atid and my party, the Blue and White Party, are very much central. And that brings me to your question. And the question is, what is the most important thing currently in the Israeli political arena to take care of? And the most immediate current issue, apart from the geostrategy and Iran and the constant threats that are definitely to be taken care of by Israel, that is the economy, given the current situation brought about by the COVID-19 epidemic, and the fact that very many people in this country are unemployed, are in a very difficult situation, particularly those marginalized ultra-Orthodox and the Arab communities. And that is something that the center parties, and not only, all parties that are serious about taking care of Israeli citizens have a real plan for, an economic plan to take care of creating newly sustainable sources of income and employment opportunities, and that is extremely important for the very many people that will stop getting payments from the government in this coming summer, very few months from now.
So, Ruth, I think that's really important, and we're going to come on specifically to corona-related issues in a few minutes. Emmanuel, you have a grand understanding of diplomacy and international relations. So, is Iran the biggest issue facing Israel?
It's one of the biggest issues facing Israel, but it's not, of course, the only one. There's a very wide consensus in Israel regarding the Iranian threat. The debate is more about what to do on whether or not to cooperate and encourage the Biden administration to renegotiate a new deal with the Iranian regime and the other signatories of the JCPOA. But that is a consensual issue in Israel. There are all the very urgent issues to deal with. Besides I mean, of course, that's my expertise. I'm a professor in international relations. I can talk to you about foreign affairs for a long time, but I think this is not, we have very pressing domestic issues in Israel, starting with the fact that we don't have a state budget. For 2 years, we haven't had a budget. I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. The reason why we decided to walk out of Likud and to challenge Netanyahu is because he blocked the passing of a budget in cold blood, just in order to violate the agreement he had signed with Blue and White, and this at the height of the biggest economic crisis in Israel's history. We need to have a functioning coalition. We've had elections, snap elections for the past 2 years, every 6 months. We need a stable government. Netanyahu is not able to do that. He's tried 3 times in a row, and he has failed. He only had 60 NKs after the first elections in 2019, 55 after the second election of 2019, and 58 after the election of 2020. There's no way he's going to get a majority. We need a stable majority in order to manage the country. And that is, I think, the first priority and the biggest threat to Israel today is reestablish unity instead of inciting one side of the population against the other, dividing and rule, which is what Netanyahu has been doing, this violent public discourse that he's been encouraging. I think Netanyahu is very charismatic. As you know, he's an excellent public speaker, but what Israel needs at this point is not a rock star who is corrupt. It is a CEO who can manage the country and could put it back together and who can have a functioning coalition.
So Yishai, Fleisher, tell me, is all politics domestic politics?
Oh, certainly not. Very important to have excellent relations around the world. I think that I don't think people even understand the hugeness of the Abraham Accords impact on this region. First thing, it was the destruction of the theory, the thesis that you have to have peace with the Palestinians before you can have peace with the rest of the Arab world. So the Arab world is very important to us. I think we're very important to the Arab world today. This leads back to what Paul said, that Iran is a big danger. Iran is not just a danger to Israel, it's a danger to the Sunni Arab states. There are new Sunni Arab leaders that are rising up, if it's MBS in Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and others, and they are looking to Israel to be a regional strength, to be a regional defense provider, kind of a local America, if you will. And so, no, not all politics is, not all issues are local. At the same time, what I said before, which was challenged by Ruth, which is, I wasn't saying that there's going to be a coalition of 80, but Israel is leaning intellectually and with their votes towards nationalism, which is very important. Now, if you would ask me,
Yishai, if I could interrupt, for the constituency that you speak, is the biggest issue in their life annexation of the West Bank or parts of the West Bank?
Yeah, it is. But I wouldn't call it annexation. We prefer to call it sovereignty. And the act of sovereignty, or the act, if you will, of annexation. Annexation is annexing somebody else's land. This wouldn't be an annexation of somebody else's land. It would be sovereignty in Judea, where in Judea and Samaria, where there's already, with Eastern Jerusalem, about 600,000 Jews. 1 out of 10 Israelis, Jewish Israelis, lives today in Judea and Samaria, in places like Ma'ale Adumim and Efrat and Ariel, etc. And it is very important, but it's not the act.
I must question, Yishai, if my apologies, if
Sure.
we would have annexed, or rather, as you call it, brought our own jurisdiction or sovereignty over the West Bank or parts of, as was planned before the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Accords would not have come through. And yet you hail the Abraham Accords. They're a game changer, they're a strategic asset to the state of Israel. They clearly said, the ruler of the UAE, that one of the main conditions was that annexation would not take place.
Well, first thing, the condition was that it would be delayed, and our government
No,
agreed.
that was in an internal political arena. They made it very clear.
I want to tell you that I don't think any country, especially any other country around the world, should be determining the sovereign borders of a sovereign country. And so I'm all in favor of the Abraham Accords. I don't agree with that particular aspect of it, but in general, I think we have to have great relations with Arabs. And I work on Abraham Accords locally in Hebron with the Jabri clan and other clans that we're really working to facilitate Abraham Accord style dialogue in the so-called West Bank. But in any case, listen, that was the deal that was made. I didn't agree to that aspect of the deal. But I wanted to focus, and I wanted to say exactly this. Sovereignty is not an act where you're like, okay, here's an act of Congress, an act of Knesset, and now we're sovereign. The big problem that we have is that our state is not acting like a sovereign in Judea and Samaria, especially in Area C. Here we have a problem that lands are being taken over willy-nilly through fake farming, the building of all kinds of Palestinian outposts that are, start off with all kinds of European Union funded caravans and then become immediately a town that was now historical Palestine, etc. So we've got a land grab that's going on, and that's happening because the state of Israel is not acting like a sovereign in land that is very important to it for the future. And so it's
Yishai, but on both sides actually land grabbing here, because you're having the extension of settlements, you have the extension of Palestinian properties. On both sides actually doing the exact same thing and just using the same terminology. In international conflict, and I'm sure Emmanuel will talk about this, there's something called mirror imaging in conflict, where the other side perceives itself to be the victim. And aren't we actually doing just that here?
First thing, Howard, I want to tell you something. If you want to bring a spokesman for the Palestinian cause, you are welcome to do so. I am not that. I am spokesman for the Jewish cause, and I believe that Israel is the Jewish state, and I believe that Judea is a very important.
The angle.
What's that? I can't hear you.
We are all spokespeople for the Jewish cause, but you have a very particular angle.
Yes, I'm saying he asked me a question about are we mirroring the Palestinian thing? I don't think the Jewish people building their houses in Judea is a land grab. I think that that's exactly where we need to be. Moreover, the so-called settlements, the communities of Judea and Samaria, really work under tremendous scrutiny of Israeli law. Area C under the Oslo Accords was to be understood to be tested if it would ever become Palestine. It was basically now been abrogated by the Palestinian Authority, and I would like to see the state of Israel cancel the whole ideology of the Oslo Accords. But in any case, we build with tremendous oversight of the Israeli legal system. I mean, absolute scrutiny. Here there is, and this is now documented by the Regavim organization, there's literally a land grab. I could see it out my window. It's not something that I would say to you, we're doing on that level. I wish we were doing something on that level, because we're not. And in 10 years' time, if we don't hold on to this land, it will be stolen right from under our noses. And this land is the future of Israel. This is where Israel existed 3,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago. It's going to exist there today. It's the best air in the country. It's the strategic highland that controls the security. For example, if we would leave Hebron Hebron, we would have a Hamas state there in no time, just like we did in Gaza. Even today, Hebron is about 80% Hamas. Even though I talked about Abraham Accords with certain tribes, we have many tribes today that are under the Hamas way of thinking. And so if you walked, and I showed this in the White, when I came to the White House to present alternatives to the two-state solution, I explained to them, I showed them a map. I said to them, you're fighting Iran on the one hand. On the other hand, you would like us to potentially leave Hebron. You will have an Iranian outpost in the hills south of Jerusalem. You can't have that. And on top of that, this is a very simple phrase, which is, it's our land. There are other people there. Yes, there are other people, and we want them to have decencies and opportunities, but it's our land. That's what people like myself believe. That's our inner narrative for various reasons, including purchase. It's our land because we purchased much of this land. It's also our land because we fought it in wars, defensive wars that we've gained the land, like in 1967. Also because international law recognized everything west of the Jordan River as to be a state of Israel. And of course, if you're a believer, then you know that the Bible, the Torah tells us that this is our land as well. It's a small plot of land within a big Arab world. And we have to hold on to it and defend it as in the way of behavior of the Middle East. This is how any other Arab tribe would behave. They would hold on to what's theirs and not allow it to be stolen. And we're being tested and we're failing on certain things. But there's many issues. Of course, for us locally, that is the issue. But the Abraham Accords creates an atmosphere where it shows that we're not racist. We're in favor of Arab-Jewish relations. It's just that we think that this plot of land is ours and we want to hold on to it and make sure that we have our vision of peace is the following: a strong Israel, a strong Jewish Israel, surrounded by strong Arab countries in cooperation. That's the way we see it. We understand this is an Arab region, and we bless our Arab cousins. But this land is ours, and a strong Israel surrounded by strong Arab countries. That's the formula for peace going forward.
So we're going to come back in another minute, and we're going to talk about South African-Israel relations. But before we do that, one of the sponsors for this evening is, in fact, the Sheba Medical Center. And we did an amazing webinar with Sheba a few weeks ago where we spoke to some of the people who are leading the fight against things like Alzheimer's and cancer around the world. And we've really seen, we even announced during that webinar, the first international results ever in a double-blind trial into ivermectin, which is one of the drugs that people believe has a major impact upon COVID. So, Danny, let's hear from Sheba. We're going to run a poll straight after that, and let's come back and talk about the very difficult subject of Israel-South Africa relations.
Only those who know how the day starts, but not how it ends, who tried, succeeded, then tried again, those who worried, those who did not give up, those who felt the weight of responsibility on their shoulders, only those who saw the end and realized it was only the beginning, who brought new life into the world, who've tasted victory, those who constantly seek out the next discovery, those who believed, only those who slept 2 hours a night, who removed all social barriers, who kept their cool, those who dared, supported, protected, laughed, made others laugh, pioneered, only those who broke new ground, who wake up every morning to carve a new path, only they understand hope has no boundaries. Sheba Tel HaShomer, City of Health.
So, Danny, you're going to run a poll for Sheba now for people who are interested in Sheba and want more information. But let us also just take note of the fact that last week, Sheba was rated one of the 10 best hospitals in the world. And there are so many South Africans who've been unable to get treatment in South Africa. And Sheba South Africa, under the guidance of Naomi Hadar, has taken people from South Africa for life-saving treatment in Israel at Sheba Medical Center, and names that we would know. Famous people in South Africa. Paula, in fact, You had Kolani Gwala staying in your home for many, many months while he went into remission for the treatment of his cancer while he was being treated at Sheba. It was only when he returned back to South Africa that he got infected and was unable to return. And unfortunately, Sheba couldn't save his life. But Kolani stayed with you in Israel, did he not?
Yes, he did. He was here for a couple of weeks. Here in Tel Aviv. He kept it quiet in South Africa. He was hoping that he could run his radio show from my living room. And 702 were actually in the process of trying to send him over equipment, but it got stopped at customs and it was taking a long time to sort out. But he was going, I think almost once a week or once every 2 weeks, he was going for checkups and for treatment. He was quite ill when he was here. But just before he came back to South Africa, he had the good news that they'd managed to stop the growth of the cancer. So the cancer had returned. He was on a trial, obviously something that hadn't been tried anywhere else in the world, some concoction of different medications. And they'd managed to stop the cancer. And the next step was to actually have it go backwards, remiss. But he was missing his family in South Africa. So he went to South Africa and I think he picked up swine flu and he landed up in hospital in South Africa and then he was just too ill to come back. And I know Naomi Hadar from Sheba, when she went to see him at hospital, she told me that he said, please Naomi, the only thing I want to do is come back to Israel. But it was just impossible to bring him back.
And I know just in the week before he passed away, Sheba, in fact, sent people to South Africa to plead with him to come back to save his life at Sheba. But unfortunately, then it was just too late. So an amazing facility, an amazing opportunity. And thank you to Sheba for sponsoring today's webinar and for everyone in South Africa who are supporting Sheba. We were speaking earlier about the Abraham Accords, and Sheba, in fact, had a fundraiser in South Africa a few months ago. And one of the people who attended was, in fact, the UAE ambassador to South Africa, who on behalf of the UAE government donated 2 million rand to Sheba through South Africa. So a truly, actually beautiful, beautiful thing and shows the workings of the Abraham Accord. But Ambassador Arthur Lenk, let's talk about Israel-South Africa relations. It's not an easy thing to talk about. You went through nearly four years of a relatively tough time in South Africa. You always said to me that in South Africa, there's an awful lot of noise. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting. Just this weekend, the Zulu king passed away. King Goodwill Zwelithini passed away, I think, yesterday or the day before.
Zwelithini yesterday, yeah.
Yeah, and just before I arrived in South Africa in 2012, he came to the National Day, the Yom Ha'atzmaut event at the Israeli embassy. And I met with him a number of times, and he was planning on coming to Israel. But there's a loud, very tiny group of South Africans who feel very, very strongly connection with our Palestinian neighbors. And it really impacts the government and on the ability of official Israel to work with official South Africa. But I found that when I traveled around South Africa, when I got away from Pretoria, that I found friends everywhere. And I found opportunities and thinking of the Zulu King and the kinds of projects he was involved with the Jewish community, I think is an example of the kinds of things that could be done if we were able to turn the page. But I think that it's interesting that it's not hate or anti-Semitism that brings on the position, I think, of the ANC, and I'm certainly not a spokesman for the ANC, but there's a lot of complicated history between Israel and South Africa. It goes back a lot of years, and there's a lot of baggage. And for me as an ambassador, I couldn't change what happened in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. I could only look forward progressively and say, here's Israel, here's the kind of relationship we could have. And I think that when people talk about countries like the UAE or Bahrain or Kenya or Uganda or countries around the world that are deepening their relationship with Israel, I think South Africans, both official South Africa and non-official South Africans, see that, and it complicates the simple narrative of Israel bad, Palestinians good. And so I think that you and I talked while I was in South Africa about having this radical optimism of being intense finding the positivity and the creative possibilities. And then that's the way I spent my time in South Africa.
So Arthur, there is no South African ambassador in Israel. Does anyone care?
Well, two different things. One, there is a South African embassy, and it opens 5 days a week, and there's somebody running that office, and there's an Israeli ambassador in Pretoria, and certainly people running that office, and the relationship exists. But politically, diplomatically, I'm not sure how vital it is for Israel. It's vital for the 328 participants I see on this Zoom call.
Well, there are a lot more watching on YouTube and Facebook. So
thousands of our South African brothers and sisters are here with us tonight. And it shows how much they care about Israel and the future of Israel. And that's wonderful. And that was obvious long before I arrived as an Israeli ambassador. So that's true. But I think that one, politically in Israel today, it's a non-issue. The perception is that we have good relations with the vast majority of countries in the world, certainly across Africa, and in our region, and South Africa is missing out, and I think that there are opportunities for South Africa that could gain, whether it was in water management or in agriculture or in cyber technology or in a million other areas where Israeli expertise could be useful for South Africa if only there were more opportunities. And I think the job of the Israeli embassy is to find more opportunities.
So Paula Slier, in 1992, I took the only ANC delegation to ever visit Israel. It was the ANC Youth League. And after a very tough discussion, which they had together with then the PLO wasn't unbanned yet, but they met with Saib Erekat and Hanan Ashrawi and a few other people, and things went a little awry. And Hirsch Goodman had dinner with them on their last evening. And I will never forget the words that he said to them. He said, "You must understand, you are completely irrelevant in our lives. You are a small country at the end of a forgotten continent." He said, "I have some interest." Now, Hirsch Goodman was military correspondent for Haaretz, ex-South African, quite a famous journalist in Israel. But he said, "You must understand, I have some personal interest because I'm an ex-South African. But you must understand South Africa, where you fit into the world. You're completely irrelevant in our lives." Is that still true today, or is it in fact more true today?
I mean, I'd hazard a guess and say it's even more true. I worked for many years at the SABC, as you know, and as important as South Africa was when I was working at the South African Broadcasting Corporation, is how unimportant South Africa is when I'm based here in Israel and reporting from the Middle East. I think the last time South Africa was a big story was when Mandela died, maybe a little bit with the whole Oscar Pistorius trial, but South Africa never makes it. And I mean, I actually am not even talking just Israel, I'm talking international news. You know, those of us who are very connected to South Africa think it's such a big story, but on the international stage, it's not. I think
Paula, if I could just jump in on this, South Africa has been mentioned a lot over the last 6 months, but as a strain of the COVID virus.
Sorry, you are right. And you know, for those of us who travel between South Africa and Israel, it's been, when I tell people I'm coming back from South Africa to Israel, it's a lot of raised eyebrows, and people here are very concerned about those of us who fly between the two countries because we might be carrying the strain with us. I think just 2 points maybe. I think the biggest problem is the apartheid analogy. I think that's just become part of the lingo. So if you listen to the BDS, for example, Israel is an apartheid state has just become a phrase that no one even disputes anymore. And whether you understand what apartheid was or whether you don't understand what apartheid was, everybody here knows that phrase. And I'm talking both Israelis and Palestinians. And the second point I wanted to mention, which maybe follows on from what Arthur was saying, is that I think South Africa is potentially the loser here, that South Africa lost an opportunity through what South Africa went through in terms of its truth and reconciliation and creating a new country. South Africa could have brought a lot to the table in terms of restarting talks between Israelis and Palestinians, which have been stalled. South Africa had a lot of that credibility. I don't know if the feeling is so much anymore that South Africa is so relevant and would be able to do that, but I certainly feel that that was a lost opportunity. But in general, I just, you know, South Africa really is quite irrelevant here in Israel.
So we're going to ask Ruth about that in 1 second. But before we do that, Arthur, Philip Krawitz is posting in the chat and he's saying, Ambassador Lior Kenan, who was your successor in Pretoria, is in fact, his term of office is about to expire. What happens then? You're just on mute.
You know, I thought I was irreplaceable. No, I didn't. But I mean, you know, Howard, ambassadors, they come and they go. And sometimes you like them more, and sometimes you like them less, and sometimes they're able to do more, and sometimes they're able to do less. I understand that the Foreign Ministry has already nominated a next ambassador. I think that it is among the huge pile of things that the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister can't agree on. And so all of these professional appointees of ambassadors are waiting for the government to approve. I mean, who knows when that's going to happen? But then, of course, Israel will share the name with Dirko in Pretoria, and inshallah, in our summer of 2021, the new ambassador will arrive. And I expect that all of the thousands of you on this Zoom will treat him well.
Ruth, is this something that is of any concern? Is it worth trying to improve relations between the two countries? You're South African, you're Israeli, you sit in the Knesset. Is it of any interest, or is it also way down on your agenda?
I think that international relations, and having been the international affairs advisor of former President Shimon Peres, and also the head of the Deputy Director General of the Federation of All Local Governments in Israel, pertaining to the international arena. I think that international relations and creating strong ties between people is something that is extremely important to Israel as a whole. I do, however, tend to agree with Paula as to where this issue stands amidst people in general in Israel, the general public, and the Knesset. It is not an issue. It is simply not on the agenda. And that's not to say that those who understand the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and decision makers shouldn't take very significant steps to strengthen the ties, because there are repercussions to the relations growing colder and further apart. I think that there is a very small yet significant story that can help in that particular regard, and that is the inclusion of the Cape-colored Corps who fought with General Allenby very near the Megiddo region and the Emek Israel region, and never really having had any kind of legitimacy, or they were never put on a pedestal or thanked properly for what they had done indirectly in terms of paving the way to the establishment of the State of Israel. And that is something that the Regional Council of Megiddo, in fact, has an interest with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs to raise awareness for within South African public.
So Ruth, let's just very quickly tell that story, because it's towards the end of the First World War. It is the British fighting to decolonize the area from the Turks. And exactly. near Megiddo, which is the biblical site where Armageddon will take place, the last battle before the coming of the Messiah, not far away from there, in a place called Square, I understand.
Absolutely. You're well aware.
A battle was fought by the Cape-colored Corps against the Turks, a very decisive battle that they won and helped in the decolonization of Israel from Turkish colonization.
And not only that, Howard, but the interesting thing is it was the very first time in which colored people, or rather people of color from South Africa, were in fact allowed to be fighting as officers and as soldiers in a battle by the British.
So I know there's a group in South Africa that are of people in the army whose ancestors fought, and some of whom died at Megiddo in this battle. It's certainly going to be the topic of a webinar, hopefully, that we do in the not too distant future.
a very nice and beautiful human bridge between Israel and South Africa.
So let's in fact turn to Emmanuel. You're the foreign policy expert here. I'm going to use a bit of English or a bit of Yiddish and say, does in fact the Israeli government say to the South African government, Kushmir in Tochas, you don't want us, we don't actually care, you know, you're the loser in this entire battle? Or is there some strategic reason why Israel should be putting an effort to try and improve relations between the two countries? And is it even possible?
Well, first of all, if you want a comprehensive and detailed explanation and description of the relation between South Africa and Israel, don't forget to read in my book. There's a whole chapter on Israel's foreign policy towards Africa in general and South Africa in particular. But I wish that the expression you used, Israel was saying it only to South Africa, because we have, and Ambassador Lenk probably knows this, there are about nearly 40 ambassadors who are waiting for their appointments by the foreign ministry. And this is also part of our dysfunctional government. I wish that Ruth described the blue and white joining Netanyahu to create checks and balances and make a functional government. Fortunately, Benny Gantz was completely used by Netanyahu, and Netanyahu being an old political fox and Benny Gantz a novice, and this government is dysfunctional. We have over 40 potential ambassadors waiting for their appointment, not only in South Africa, but also in France, Japan, and many other countries. So I think that generally speaking, obviously, as Paula mentioned, South Africa is not exactly, with all due respect, at the center of Israel's concern and of Israel's elections. But I think that a lot of work has been done already and needs to be done to change the way Israel is perceived. I mean, historically, of course, the ANC always had very close ties with the PLO. And I think that here the bottom line is, when we talk to South Africa, and I mean, South Africa is an important player, of course, in Africa, and also because of its ties with other countries with which Israel has very difficult relations. But I think that, you know, a theme, an idea that is not clear to many South Africans is that, yes, Israel is a nation state, and so are most countries in the world today. So are most European countries, in fact. So South Africa is not a nation state, but I think we have to explain that the concept that we talked before about the supposed contradiction between being a Jewish state and a democracy, I don't think there's such a contradiction. Nobody talks about such a contradiction when it comes to Japan, Germany, or Sweden. To explain the fact that, yes, you can be a nation state and a democracy. There's no contradiction here. And we have to make that point, especially in countries that are multiracial, multi-confessional, such as South Africa. And this is a point that I think that needs to be made very clearly in South Africa. And of course, historically, as I said, the political leadership of the ANC will never be well-disposed and friendly to Israel. But I think that the fact that Israel, that will be my last point, you know, historically, Israel had very good relations in the past with many African countries. They were severed in 1973 and restored later on. And for a long time, Israel used the special relation that we had with Pretoria during the apartheid regime. But again, most Western countries had special relation with the Pretoria regime and the apartheid, not only Israel. And only when Israel was able to make peace with Egypt did many countries in Africa renew their relation with Israel. And I think we have to use this again today with the Abraham Accord, saying, you know, if the Arab states themselves are making peace with Israel, why are you guys being more royalist than the king or more Catholic than the Pope? And I think this is also an argument that we have to use.
I think it's interesting that, in fact, while Israel and the apartheid government had a very close relationship, so did France and England and the United States.
France, West Germany, the United States, Britain. Israel proportionally did not have more. I mean, France provided about over nearly half of Pretoria's military hardware. And do you know, when the British and the Americans dropped the apartheid regime, it's only when the threat of the Soviet Union receded, and when they no longer feared that an ANC-ruled South Africa would align with the Soviet Union. But they did business with Pretoria until they imposed sanctions in 1986.
As, of course, did Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if oil had been cut off by those two countries, apartheid would have probably ended 15 years sooner.
Yeah.
So, Paul, your party has come in for a lot of criticism. You have the prime ministership, you have the foreign ministry in Gabi Ashkenazi, and yet we see
Ashkenazi's blue and white.
Sorry, so Gabi Ashkenazi blue. Forgive me. I've said so. Is the problem?
Blame it on blue and white.
Okay. So
Bibi Hataveli was the last foreign minister, and she did a good job.
So sorry, do you see Ruth? You saying he's no longer blue and white?
What was that?
No longer blue and white. By the way, he did indeed do an amazing job. And the disagreement about the ambassadors, and there are quite a few of them in waiting, is because there's a disagreement by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, yes, about their appointments. Why? We are holding
Can I say something?
Hostage.
Can I say
We're
something?
holding them
when
hostage.
you speak, you don't give all the facts. You don't give all the facts.
Okay. Ruth, let Paul have you say.
My apologies.
When Bibi was going to go to the UAE, in the end, he was allowed to fly over Jordan. The reason he ended up not going was because of his wife's appendectomy operation. Now, the whole thing with Jordan was only one incident. We are allowed to fly over Jordan was because the prince decided to visit the Temple Mount, and he brought a large contingent of military people with him against agreements with Jordan and Israel, and they told me he only can bring the amount of people in that according to the agreements, and he refused and went back to Jordan, and that's what caused the rift. It had nothing to do with what you said.
I completely disagree with that. There are very many issues with Jordan.
There are, but I'm talking about the incident that you claimed that Bibi and Israel were not allowed to fly the plane to the UAE. They were allowed to fly the plane to the UAE, and the only reason he didn't go was because of his wife's appendectomy.
Emmanuel, do you want to settle that?
I would just like to explain that Ruth is 100% right on that.
Okay, let Emmanuel speak. Paul, let Emmanuel speak, please.
No, I just want to mention the fact that the Jordanian government did decide not to let the flight of Netanyahu go through
originally,
the airspace.
I agree. Originally, that's true. But
okay, Paul, let Emmanuel speak, please. Otherwise, I'm going to have to mute you.
The Jordanian government did make that decision, and it's not only because of the health issue of Sarah Netanyahu, and there are many issues with Jordan that must be dealt with.
I would like to add something to that, with your permission, Howard. In fact,
sure, of course,
there are many issues with Jordan, and they all have to do with decision-making on the Netanyahu part of the government. For example, I'll just give one example. Very many Arab Israeli students study in Jordan, especially medicine and things related to medicine. And because Netanyahu decided to unilaterally close the Allenby Bridge, the Jordanians decided to unilaterally close Sheikh Hussein Bridge, disallowing those students to go back to their studies, for which we had to fight, and indeed allowed them, finally opened the bridge and allowed them to go back. But there are issues pertaining to the Israeli-Jordanian relations that are extremely sensitive and extremely geostrategically important to Israel that have been put aside, unfortunately, by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that is despite the fact that on other geostrategic issues, he has been fantastic. But
can I just say something?
No, Paul, no, you're waiting.
Can I just say, Benjamin Netanyahu closed the borders to everybody, not just Jordan, and that was a very good thing because it stopped the variants of the virus to get into Israel, and that's why it was done. It wasn't done just to Jordan; it was unilaterally to all countries. We closed the air, we closed the sea.
Okay, Paul, let Ruth comment, and then we're going to do one quick round of the panel and close off this evening because we've been going for nearly 2 hours.
It seems that we can go for another 4. This particular issue of closing the bridge was not for people coming in. It was for people going out, and sitting on the committees that have made those decisions. Netanyahu was pushing this issue rather than disallowing variants to come in, with which I completely agree and voted in favor of. This was an issue of closing the border for people going out. So the Jordanians were very, very unpleased with that, and sort of did something to kind of counter our students from going through the other bridge. But this is not the point. The point is that there are very many issues pertaining to Israel-Jordanian relations that, again, are extremely important on the geostrategic level to Israel that have been put aside. And Benny Gantz has put a lot of effort quietly, diplomatically, in order to make up for this marginalization because of the vast importance of Jordan for Israel.
So in our last spin round the panel, I want to start with Yishai. Yishai, you tell us that in all likelihood, 80 members of the 120 in the Knesset are going to be right-leaning. You're fairly certain that there will be a right-leaning government that comes in. Tell us your wishes for the next few years in Israeli politics.
Well, you know, there's a lot of things that we'd love to work on. If it's getting rid of bureaucracy, if it's finding a way to give our Supreme Court a little more of a framework of things that in America are so important, like standing, in which not everybody could come in and have a Supreme Court case. You have to come up from the lower courts. You have to have a case in controversy. We don't have that in Israel. We have a court that is a super activist court, maybe one of the most activist courts in the world. As I mentioned before, I think we'd love to see Israel act as a sovereign. Not just assert sovereignty, but act as a sovereign where we are. For example, we have a problem with Bedouin land takeover in the Negev and theft in the Negev. Even when I do reserves in the south of Israel, we have a tremendous fear of theft constantly, and there's just no law and order there. So we call it, you know, here in Israel, we call it Meshilut, which is being the sovereign, be the sovereign. And we have a lot more issues, and it looks like we also have an issue of an influx of immigration that's going to happen probably after COVID. There's a huge spike in building, in property sales to Jews from all over the world in the land of Israel. I've heard that, I've read the articles, but I've also heard that from real estate agents who tell me they're just working every night because people, especially in the United States, Jews are excited to buy right now. The market is high in America, and they don't feel that there's potential stability. And I saw that you had a great ad. By the way, I just want to give you kudos. Your ads are some of the most inspiring things that I've seen, all together with great speakers that we've had tonight, but also those ads themselves of Sheba and Hold Real Estate. Great stuff. And I hope that we'll see more South African Jews buying property here in the land of Israel, maybe making Aliyah. I'd like to see more tourism. You know, we hit a record before COVID of 4.1 million tourists to Israel, and that's great. We could pat ourselves on the back. Turkey in our region has about 52 million visitors a year. And so we, you know, Jerusalem, the holy city, Tel Aviv, the lively city, still are not even close to other great cities in the world in terms of tourism. And I think that people around the world are going to want to connect to the Holy Land and come here. I think also another thing that we're going to have to see is we're going to have to build up our Navy. I really do believe that Israel's got to be a bigger power in this region. And if it's not going to fill the vacuum, then other players, Turkey, Russia, China, are going to play to be the controllers of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and the Gulf. And so I'm very much looking forward to a stronger Israel that's going to give this region the stability that it needs. And I'm really, really excited about Saudi Arabia becoming an official, not just back channel, but an official ally of Israel. And I'm looking forward to driving and even having my wife drive, meaning to say that women drivers are also a part of the scene now in Saudi Arabia. So I'm really looking forward to, I think we're all looking forward to this region being, coming together as an Abrahamic alliance, and then maybe bring some of the countries that we already have peace with, but it's a cold peace, like Egypt and Jordan, a little bit more in line with the atmosphere of the Abraham Accords. So the next few years are very important. There's really a lot to do to make this country a stronger state, a prouder Jewish state. Of course, also give liberties and opportunities to those Palestinians who want to be part of Israel. I hope, of course, that we, move towards getting rid of the Oslo paradigm.
Sorry, Yishai, let me just actually question that. Are you saying that any Palestinian who wishes to be part of Israel will get full Israeli citizenship, allowed to vote, and it will be a fully democratic? Is that your policy?
No, that's certainly not. My policy, I wrote a New York Times article about 5 alternatives to the two-state solution. And
well, you seem to be proposing a one-state solution.
I do propose one state, and I'm
with
against
full democratic rights to everyone, for everyone who lives.
Howard, you already stated that, and I said that is not correct.
Oh, not correct. Not correct. Okay, I was just not understanding what you were actually saying about people who want to be part of it. Okay, so very quickly, because we still have to get around the panel.
Sure. Just very quickly, there are other options. For example, if you look at places in the United States like Puerto Rico, where 2 million people have American citizenship, but they don't vote for U.S. president, and they vote for non-voting congressmen and senators for Congress. That's just one example of a way that in another country, a situation was dealt with in a democratic country. In our country, which is an ethnic national state, we've got to figure out how to give people rights and opportunities, but not necessarily to take away the character of the Israeli state. How do we do that? Do we give them their citizenship back in Jordan, but they continue to be residents here? Do we give them Jerusalem-style residency status in Judea and Samaria?
Yishai,
it's a serious discussion that cannot be done in a very short moment.
I appreciate that. I want to give everyone else on the panel time to talk.
Sure.
But I just hope that you understand that for a South African who grew up with Bantustans and an apartheid, the sort of things you're talking about terrify me as a Democrat, as a South African, and I hope you're sensitive to how that plays out to our audience who grew up under apartheid.
We're sure are concerned about that, but we have to ensure the safety and security of our Jewish state, and we'll do our best to give more rights and liberties to more people. In the end, a bigger Israel means more liberties for more people in this region.
Okay, Paul, give us your bracha. What are you hoping for in these elections? How many seats will you be happy with for your party? And give us a 1-minute vision of what the next few years look like for you and your party.
Well, I think we'll probably see a right-wing government of about 62 seats. You have to remember the government before the first election started with 61, and then they added Israel Beitenu to make it 67. Okay.
So how many for Likud?
60. I'm talking for the coalition.
But I'm talking Likud, your party. How many would you be happy with? How many seats?
35.
35. Okay. Okay, and tell us 1 minute your vision for what the next few years look like.
Well, my first vision is that we get rid of coronavirus. Okay. Once we get rid of coronavirus, the economy, which is already starting to grow, will move ahead. It will take care of bringing people that are unemployed back into employment. The shekel is at the highest value in over 12 years against other currencies. So everything is there in place for the economy to grow. And investment is very high because of our high tech. I think we're really moving in the right direction. And I think if we continue to move in the right direction, that we will continue to have very high ratings. We had a rating last year, 85% before the coronavirus, 85% of the people were happy with their life in Israel. Look, I'm happy with my life in Israel. I'm not happy with my life in Israel with the coronavirus because it never happened before in my lifetime, We have the Abraham Accords. I think it's very good that we added Morocco's in. There's other countries that are Muslim countries. Indonesia wants to become possibly diplomatic relations. It's good that we expand this. There's no BDS in Muslim countries such as the UAE. They don't care we put made in Israel from stuff that's made in Judea, Samaria. All that BDS is in Europe, the typical anti-Semites, and the United States. But I wanted to say one other thing.
Okay, no, Paul, I have to stop you there because Ruth,
very important to me.
10 seconds.
Okay, we need to find a solution for Russians that want to become Jewish people and a compromise with the Orthodox. If we do that between the Orthodox parties and the Russian parties, it will be excellent for Israel. I want to see that in the future, and also do something about the overreach of the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Ruth, I would say we're moving from right to left, but I don't know where to put Emmanuel. So let's rather skip over some things and move to you. I know you have another Zoom that starts at 8 o'clock. Where would you be happy for Blue and White to end up, and how do you see the next coalition unfold?
You know, Howard, if you allow me, we've spoken so many minutes and exhausted our audiences with so much politics. I want to say something is a teeny bit at a tangent, and I hope you forgive me. Very recently in the plenary of the Knesset, I got up and, you know, having spent 3 years in Cairo, I think naivete is something that cannot be said about me, but got up and said something that perhaps may be interpreted as a teeny bit naive, and asked my fellow members of Knesset and ministers and the general public, both Arab and Jewish in my country, which I love with all my heart and more, to speak a little bit more respectfully to one another. I think that President Ruvi Rivlin said that our country is divided into 4 different tribes. I would beg to differ and argue that there are very many more than 4 tribes, but there is a lot of, I would say, divisive politics in Israel. The discourse has become very negative, aggressive. And you know, the Jewish people's strength, the Jewish peoplehood, which I find is the essence of this entire discussion, even the epitome. We're talking about Israeli politics with Jews of the diaspora mainly, is in our unity and speaking more respectfully with derech eretz, arvut adadit, common help, and really values of a shared destiny, which we have with one another, despite differences of opinion, and also with minorities in our country, is something that we shouldn't lose sight of. And that is what I wish to end off with. This is my life, not only slogans, and perhaps we need another separate seminar for this, but I apologize to everybody. I have to leave because I have another Zoom call, but speaking to South Africans and with such an accent all over, it's been very, very touching for me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Emmanuel, last words. After your words, we're going to boot all of our politicians off, and we're going to have one last minute with Arthur and Paula. So Emmanuel, tell us your hopes and dreams going forward for your party.
Look, I made Aliyah by myself at age 22. This is the best decision I've ever made. I'm a proud father of 4 children, 2 of whom are in the army. One is an officer. And I got involved in politics out of concern with my country. As I said, I very much admire the work that Benjamin Netanyahu has done in foreign policy and what he did as finance minister between 2003 and 2005. But he has become toxic, he has become dysfunctional, and I very much hope that we will be finally able to form a government that will bring stability in the country, that will put the interest of the country before the political survival of one man who has turned his once democratic party into a personal dictatorship, who has used incitement of one population against the other, and who has failed to dealing with many pressing issues, such as reforming the legal system, which he never did. Yishai talked before about the lack of law and order in the Negev desert. What we want to do with Tikva Chadasha, with Gideon Sa'ar's party, is to form a wide coalition led by a center-right prime minister that would pass a budget, that will handle the crisis, that will pass reforms. We will limit the term of a prime minister to 8 years. There's no reason in the world why in a democracy somebody should be in power for 15 years. By the way, by running against Netanyahu, basically wants to be prime minister for 19 years. This is absurd. This is absurd. And when people stay too long in power, they become dysfunctional and toxic. So my dream for the next years is to have finally a stable government that will focus on actual issues that we have to focus on. The last one, if you remember, a week ago, the Supreme Court had to rule on the issue of recognizing or not recognizing conversions. And this is because for 16 years, Netanyahu has failed to address the issue, even though he appointed a commission to deal with it. These are all issues that we need to deal with in the next 4 years to make Israel more peaceful, more functional, And I very much hope that after March 23, we will be able to thank Netanyahu for what he did and send him home.
Emmanuel, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I think the one thing that is so evident speaking to all of these politicians is just the quality of the politicians that you're speaking to. People with deep insight and knowledge and understanding, and that's absolutely such a pleasure to have. So Arthur, Paula, let's see if we can get your camera back on. But the last words go to both of you. Arthur, are these people delusional? Where are we going to land up on March the 23rd at midnight, or March the 24th? Who's going to be in control of the government?
Well, we're not going to know on March 24th, Howie. Sorry. But
and then we go straight into Pesach, so we may not know for a while.
That's exactly right. So it's obvious that a new coalition is going to be formed, and if it can't, a fifth election round. And I'm not sure that makes our prime minister unhappy, because possession is 9/10 of the law, isn't it?
Possession is 9/10 of the law.
I'm just going to mute one of Paula's things because we're getting some feedback.
And so it's going to be interesting to see whether all of that anti-Bibi crew are able to find a way to get along, because I think that it's right to say that they don't have anything else that binds them together. But if that's a majority, then perhaps that's the way for Israel to move forward. And if not, we're you know what? We like to think that we're world champions in vaccines. Well, we're world champions in repeated elections too. I don't know if that's going to be an Olympic event in Tokyo this summer, but I'm not sure that we're going to come out with a clear answer.
So, Arthur, if you were a betting man 2 months from now, who would be your prime minister?
I think that I think that we're going to find 2 months from now, we're going to still be in a negotiation interim period with no new government found, and so the Netanyahu family will still be living on Balfour Street.
Not a house that I understand that the prime minister's wife likes.
She doesn't want to leave, though.
She doesn't want to leave, but not one she likes. Paula, they say fools and prophets predict the future. I know you're not a prophet. Are you willing to make a prediction?
Well, Howard, my internet connection here is pretty shaky. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You're looking sparkling. I looked earlier. You were at about 16 degrees in Tel Aviv. At the time, we were 27 in Durban, 22 in Johannesburg, 21 in Cape Town. I think Jerusalem was only 11, but it looks like summer on your side.
I have to say that I think it's going to be Netanyahu again. I mean, polls can be proven wrong, but there's nothing in this election that's different to what we've seen before. The one thing maybe that's interesting for the listeners is that this will be the first election that Israel's holding deep in the throes of coronavirus, because the last election was back in March, where people were talking about coronavirus and it was a scary thing, but it wasn't actually a reality. And I did an interesting report in the last few days how Israel's preparing for coronavirus. And they'll have the election officials at all the stations in hazmat suits. They've set up 5,000 more stations than before. So the country's going to have something like 15,000 polling stations, all with safe distancing, all with people having to wear masks. The hospitals have prepared special rooms where people can go and vote, and they're also organizing for people who can't leave their beds, that they will be able to vote from their beds. They've also converted some buses into mobile stations. So if suddenly a positive coronavirus, or if there's an indication that something's gone wrong in one of the polling stations in terms of coronavirus, they can move the polling station outside. So it's a huge enterprise that Israel's undertaking in terms of being able to hold these elections during the pandemic. But in terms of your question, who's going to win? The polls suggest, and maybe I'm a fool, but I think it's going to be Netanyahu again. And I think we can actually already start organizing this webinar for next year.
I have one last question for both of you, but before I ask it, I'm going to ask everyone who's watched us this evening just to give their comments in the comment section, whether you're on Facebook or Zoom or YouTube. We'd like to know who you're supporting in these elections, what do you think will happen, and what did you think of our panelists tonight? Who do you think made the most cogent and intelligent argument for all of them? But Arthur, while people are posting that information into the chat section, Israel did really badly on corona, large numbers of people infected, and yet seems to have done brilliantly on the vaccine. Was that all electioneering, or was that part of the grand scheme and plan?
No, unfortunately, I don't think that we had a grand scheme and plan. I think that regarding the vaccines, we've been great, but we've also been incredibly lucky. The fact that Pfizer picked us and was willing to let us, and we had their conditions to be the test tube for the rest of the world, is as lucky as much as good. Although the CEO of Pfizer was on Israeli TV last week, and he talked about Netanyahu calling him 30 times. He was a nudnik, and you know what? It paid off. Now the question is Paula right? Are we, the Israeli public, going to thank Netanyahu in 2 weeks' time, in a week and a half's time for doing that? But there's no question that we were both good and lucky in terms of vaccines. In terms of pandemic management, we were a disaster. The truth is we should be an island like Australia or New Zealand or Cyprus or Greece, and we weren't. And we've lost nearly 6,000 people. And I understand that come from South Africa, you say, you know what, it's been so tough in South Africa with so many more challenges, we'd happily trade places with Israel. And I get that. But we look at Australia and New Zealand and think that with better management, we would have been closer to that.
Paula, your thoughts?
Well, I think Netanyahu's tried to take personal credit for the whole coronavirus vaccine. I mean, if you listen to some of the things that he says, you would actually think that he developed the vaccine and he administered the shots himself. And the last elections, he had very much the American president, Donald Trump. And a lot of the election campaigning and the posters showed the close alliance between the two. Obviously, he doesn't have Trump this time around, but it's almost as if he replaced Trump with coronavirus. There is some criticism in the country, and this is something that we'll need to watch, that the country is opening up too soon. Now, you have at the moment about 5 million Israelis who've been vaccinated, and we're being told that it's just over 1 million more who still need to be vaccinated. And we're talking there really amongst the teenagers. And the date that's constantly given is the end of April, when all of this rollout will be finished. But we have heard from the health ministry that we mustn't rule out a fourth lockdown. You know that people in the country have been given green passes. So what a green pass or green passport is once you've had your 2 vaccinations, you then literally get something that's a printed piece of paper or something on your phone. It's not green. The green just is because you have permission. It's black and white. And the idea is that when you go into a shopping center, or when you go into a gym, or when you go into any public area, you show that green pass. I can tell you for the past week that this has been introduced. Not one public space that I have entered has actually asked me for my green pass.
Me too.
So, you know, so you can expect that businesses are flouting the rules. You can expect that that there is a possibility that we're not finished with coronavirus. And I'm just posing it out there, or putting it out there, that maybe the big push, and Netanyahu claiming to have masterminded the whole coronavirus, is something that, on the one hand, while it's been fantastic, I do think it has a political element to it.
I want to thank both of you for enormous insight that you've given all of us. I think you are the two who are not speaking politics. You're speaking and calling it the way you absolutely see it. And that's what gives great value to everyone who's watched this evening. So to all of our panelists, thank you so much for participating. To our 2 commentators, really appreciate the honesty in which you've approached the issue. But most importantly, to all of you who've watched on Zoom, on Facebook, and on YouTube, we're enormously grateful that you joined us this evening. Please join us again tomorrow night, 7 p.m, as we tell the remarkable and amazing story of Isaac Ochberg, the richest Jew in South Africa, who in 1921 decided it was his job to go and save orphans from Eastern Europe. And people like Paula Slier are sitting here on this panel today because of the work of Isaac Ochberg. We'll see you tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. Thank you for joining us, and have an amazing night ahead. Good night.
Cheers.